Good morning, and thank you for joining us for Inside Sculpture Milwaukee. I'm Lynn Schumo. I'm the Haggerty Museum's curator for academic engagement, and I'm here today with some friends from Sculpture Milwaukee, Marilu Knode, who is the Director of Curatorial Affairs and Education. We have a bit of a lag here with the slide. And Amy Kaczmarek. I'm not sure if you can see Amy. Amy is the Director of Administration and the Exhibitions Manager for Sculpture Milwaukee. And Brian Pfister, who is Sculpture Milwaukee's Assistant Director of Education and Special Projects. We created this program just to show you how museums and galleries are currently closed. There are still some great ways to see wonderful art in Milwaukee, and perhaps one of the best options is Sculpture Milwaukee because it's outdoors. So today, Amy, Marilu, and Brian are going to tell you a bit about the Sculpture Milwaukee organization and give you a bit of an insider's view as to what it takes to put on this sort of massive exhibition with pieces coming from all over. And you're also going to get a sneak peek of this year's exhibition, which has been partially installed and continues to be installed. The program will go for about 45 minutes. And then we're going to have a question and answer session. You can start submitting your questions if you have any in the little chat box on your screen. Before we get going, I also want to introduce some of my Haggerty colleagues, our marketing and development assistant, Christine Fleming, who is our manager of community engagement, and Rachel Kieselberg, who is our manager of museum administration. And Mary, Christine, and Rachel are the wizards behind today's program. They're really the technical experts who are making this whole thing happen, because I have no clue how you do all of this. So a big thank you to my colleagues. Just a few little housekeeping things. Like I said, you can start submitting your questions, and just so you all know that we will be recording this presentation. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Marilu.
Thanks so much, Lynn. Thanks to everybody for inviting me to be part of this great program. We're glad to be partnering with the Haggerty and all the different things that you all do. I'm just going to talk about the history of Sculpture Milwaukee. We were founded by Mr. Steve Marcus. You can see him on the left, and then on the right in his yellow hat. He's the chairman of the Marcus Corporation, a longtime collector. Steve had wanted to bring world-class artwork to downtown, partially to supplement the cultural offerings of the community, but also, to be frank, to generate more activity in downtown. As the city's been investing a lot of resources to revitalize our downtown, art can often be one of the generators that brings non-business people to an area that we typically wouldn't go to. We're a hybrid public-private partnership. Our other founding partner is the Downtown and Business Improvement District number 21. So on the right, you see Beth Weirick, who's the president and CEO, speaking in a very windy day. Her team members helped us set up the infrastructure for Sculpture Milwaukee and help us understand all the things that need to happen to bring the show to life. Every year we have over 100 people who help us make Sculpture Milwaukee happen. It's the artists, the lenders, the shippers, the riggers, the installation crew, our curatorial team, etc. So it's really, we feel very lucky that we have so many great partners in the city of Milwaukee. The founding art advisor is Russell Bowman, who was the former director of the Milwaukee Art Museum. He recruited me for the team in 2017. I have a decades-long history in the arts, including a decade running one of the legacy sculpture parks in the country. However, installing artwork in a park is very different than installing artwork in a city street, and you'll hear a little bit more about that as we go on. Sculpture Milwaukee is part of a national trend towards a curated public art program, not a public process. This includes the High Line in New York and the 606 in Chicago. There's no barrier to participation with public art. Everybody's free to enjoy it whenever they want to. The difficulties of public art is that it's hard to raise money for it because you don't have people coming in the front door of your organization. And it's difficult to track the demographics of the people who enjoy the work. We can estimate how many people come to downtown Milwaukee, but how much real engagement they have with the work is a little bit harder to track. So I just want to touch on a couple of things. Why are we doing global work? That's partially because we want to bring another layer of cultural meaning to the city. We want to supplement and complement what's happening here already, but we also want to show how artists are responding to the world that we all live in. And we also commission artworks, and it's really important for us to do that as an arts organization, partially because we want to invest in an artist's career, and most of the artists that we're commissioning are from Milwaukee and Chicago, so we're really putting artists from our own communities into an international context. A couple of new things for Sculpture Milwaukee this year. We are expanding into the 3rd ward. This gives us another partnership with the Black Box Fund, but it also allows us to show work to a different audience. And then also we have a group of guest curators this year. Now, guest curators are often invited into any cultural organization or museum. They help broaden your exposure. They help broaden your artistic access. We have 3 guest curators this year: Michelle Grabner, the Crown Family Professor in Painting and Drawing and Professor of Painting and Drawing at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Michelle also is a curator and critic. She runs the Suburban in Walker's Point and the Poor Farm in Manawa. So anyone who's involved in the arts in the audience, I suggest you try to follow what Michelle's doing with her programming. It's co-organized with her husband, Brad Killam. Mary Jane Jacob, who's the professor and director of the Institute for Curatorial Research and Practice at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and Lisa Sutcliffe, who's the curator of photography and media at the Milwaukee Art Museum. So this is the team that is brought works to you this year. We also have some legacy, some real significant legacy that Sculpture Milwaukee has had. A bit of a surprise for us, but we're really proud of the fact that you see in this image a Radcliffe Bailey in the foreground and a Tony Craig in the background in the close proximity to City Hall. These works have both been purchased by local philanthropists and are on public display in Milwaukee. We have many of these works now for the city. And I would hazard a guess that Milwaukee has one of the best public art collections in the country. So I'm pretty proud of this ongoing legacy that we have for the city. So next we'll talk about some of the artwork for this year. This is a piece by Milwaukee-based artist Maggie Sasso, and this is actually the installation of Maggie's piece at the Haggerty as part of the Knoll Show. And this is where I first saw Maggie's piece. I approached her last year about the possibility of retrofitting the interior of this space, of this piece, for outdoor display. And it's taken, I think, 3 engineers and some rigging advice to figure out how to do it. But Maggie's been really pretty heroic in retrofitting the piece. Her husband's also an engineer, so he's been really central to our success. Here's a picture of the piece at Maggie's house about a month ago, and showing us sort of how the work looks. Maggie and her husband wanted to really put the piece together to make sure all the parts fit, etc. And of course, I'm sure you all recognize this little house. This is actually the Coast Guard station on the breakwater. It looks like a little toy when we see it from the cliffs or from the waterfront, but it's actually a 4-story building with 4-foot thick concrete walls. Maggie's very interested in sort of the aesthetics and the symbols of water. But what really struck her about this particular building when she got close up to it many years ago is its isolation. There's no way to get to it except for a boat. And it's, I think the theme of isolation is something we can all really relate to in this day and age, given sort of the world we live in. So next. And this piece will be at the Northwestern Mutual campus in close proximity to the actual original. This is a piece by a British African artist named Thomas J. Price. Part of my curatorial work is, I know a lot of artists, I travel a lot and see a lot of work, but this is an artist that I came to see his work when it was installed in London a couple of years ago. I reached out to him. He luckily has had somebody commission another version of this. And so we were able to borrow this piece. This you see the piece here at the Foundry in London. It's never shown outside before, so we'll be the first ones to present it. And what's really interesting about Thomas Price, this piece is very, I would call it an anti-monument. It's not a self-portrait, but it certainly is an amalgam portrait of people in an area of London where there was a large influx of Caribbean immigrants in the 1970s. And it's really become a much more active dialogue right now. You probably know that the British people are tearing down their monuments as well because they don't want to see images of slavers and in their midst. And so Thomas is really commenting on the community that he is in proximity to. And so here's a picture of Thomas looking at the head, so you get a sense of scale and how large this figure is going to be. And on the right, you see a picture of them putting a patina on the head. I'm very excited to see this work in person. Thomas just did an op-ed piece for Time magazine, and he said, if you're going to replace these monuments, after you've torn down monuments to Confederates and slavers, you should probably ask artists of color to replace them. And I think this is an extremely important point. Next, we have a piece by Chicago-based artist Paula Crown, and I'm sure you recognize this image as well. This is a giant solo cup. I think we all kind of associate these cheap cups with maybe frat parties or just parties in general. This piece will be placed in the 3rd Ward. Paula is an artist and activist, and she's very concerned with the problems of pollution caused by single-use plastic. And once you see this image, I think as you go about your daily lives, you'll probably see these crushed and discarded in the street a little bit everywhere. Probably not as much today since our festival season's been canceled and we're not really allowed to communicate with each other. Paula talks about how each way in which we crush a cup is really unique to us. And she sees these different figures that she's cast and blown up as almost portraits of how we use the things in our daily lives. So this is intended to look like just a piece of garbage that's been thrown on the street, but you'll see how large it is. It's 10 feet long. And I think it'll be really a very fun and playful piece, but it's got some real serious content behind it. It's bright red, partially as an alarm or as an alert. All of this is from the artist generally. I'm also doing audio scripts with mainly the artists for their works. And so if you go onto our website, you'll hear Paula talk about her work. And she's got a lot more to say about the piece itself. The next piece, this is a really wonderful piece. It's not a video, it's an algorithm or it's a machine by African-American artist named Leslie Hewitt. She's from the East Coast. She uses phrases gathered from a bookstore in Harlem that was in operation for 42 years. She uses archival pictures of the bookstore itself to generate this really very dynamic language that you see here. This bookstore was harassed by the Hoover administration and the FBI for decades. The bookstore finally closed quite some time ago. Leslie is actually customizing this piece to include information about the city of Milwaukee. There was a Black-owned bookstore in the city that closed a while ago, I think in 2017. So you might want to ask with this kind of work, why is this algorithm on a screen sculpture? We have a very broad definition of what sculpture is. Typically people think sculpture is man on horse or mermaid in fountain. That's a very old-fashioned genre of artwork. You think about 19th century, but artists use all the tools that you use in your daily lives. And so any material that anybody uses anywhere, you can be sure that an artist is going to adapt it and adopt it and make some really surprising artwork. The thing that's really sort of dramatic about this piece is that it's not on a loop. It changes constantly. You will never see the same phrases together. It's like the way the mind works. And so you'll see this work installed in the 3rd Ward and spend some time with it. It's 42 minutes long, but I think it's going to be really kind of an elegant meditation on place and meaning. And then next we have, I want to introduce Amy and Brian and turn it over to them to talk about the work that they do.
Thanks, Marilu. We're going to get started and kind of continue on where Marilu left off, and that would be with a video now. So that piece before was sort of like a video, but this is actually a 5-minute, 30-second video from Amy Yo's titled Mobile Animation Unit. And it's actually created from a project at SAIC in which Yo's collaborated with the students to kind of animate the colorful pieces of this work. And then that footage is then assembled with other footage behind the scenes as Amy kind of recreates these into video animation. So once again, sort of thinking about the ways that sculpture and animation might actually come together in certain ways. Amy,
and Leslie Hewitt and the Amy Yo's that Marilu and Brian were just talking about is going to be located in this expanded area of North Broadway. So this will be located about a block south of the Paula Crown, and the little white box that you see, which isn't so little when you're actually there in person, is an 82-inch screen that we have installed at that location inside of the storefront that is there. So we work with our partners over at ModGen, which is the boutique store, and we've installed the screen there, and then we'll have speakers outside, which sounds easy enough, but we have to work with permitting and the city, and so it is kind of an extensive installation process. And we've really been working closely with Magic Pro, which they are experts in events, video installation, and sound. So next.
Yeah, great. And then the third and final piece that you'll see sort of rotating on that screen outside of ModGen is I'll Remember You As You Were, Not As What You'll Become by Sky Hopinka, who originates from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and he's a member of the First Nations Ho-Chunk group. And this work really kind of thinks about language and culture and the way that language really kind of derives from the way that culture is used throughout different areas of the world. So really kind of pointing that out in really in a poetic way. You can kind of see in a thumbnail at the top that he's using words and poetry, as well as at the bottom sort of abstraction, the language of abstraction, and kind of combining that all together into a really nice 12-minute video that will kind of be on a loop. And then this next work you may recognize. It was a part of our 2017 exhibition. It is by artist Paul Druka, and it is titled Shoreline Repast. And what you can see here is that it looks a lot like some historical markers that you may be familiar with. And that is intentionally so. So Paul Druka is really thinking about the landscape and the language and the markers that are around that kind of clue us into a place. And so one side has a certain set of text and the other has another set of text. And one is maybe more traditional for a sign like this and the other isn't. So the artist is really thinking about that push and pull between like what is meant to be here and what's sort of the stories that are being told by the signs in our landscape. So it's really relevant to an urban landscape, but as well as any type of preserved landscape, any type of national park that you can typically find signs of things that sort of tell the history of the place. So Paul here is sort of talking about Lake Michigan in general, kind of on both sides, and asking us to rethink that. So this work, this is a photo of it installed in 2017, and then this is it being installed this year. You can kind of see that it's not necessarily even or level, and that's intentional. The artist wants you to sort of think about what that means, and is the sign sinking? It looks kind of brand new. How do those things play together? All right. And then this next work here is by Richard Wood's Holiday Home, another one you probably recognize. So right now we just jumped from the 3rd Ward to the very east end of Wisconsin Avenue in O'Donnell Park or Museum Center Park. And you can see that this piece has a refresh. So in the kind of intro slide, you saw maybe the yellow house with the red door, and now it's pink with the green door. And it's really, really bright and cheerful, but it also has a really great story behind it. So I'm gonna let this video play and talk over it just a little bit. So this video you'll see here is a group, the GLCCC, Great Lakes Community Conservation Corps. And we worked with them, we partnered with them to construct the home last year. So the plans came from the artist, the color scheme came from the artist, but really the house was fabricated here in Wisconsin, just south of us here in Racine. So the GLCCC really focuses on training young people in different areas, and they don't have an art section previously to this partnership, so we were able to sort of introduce that to them, and it's been a really great experience for these young people to learn how the arts can impact so many different types of careers and different trajectories for that as well. We're really excited to have the work remain for another year and also have a new fresh coat of paint. I should note that the GLCCC came back this year and repainted the house early, actually during sort of the quarantine, the beginning of it. So the hope was that when people return downtown, which is still sort of on and off a little bit, that there would be a nice, fresh something to look at, something new. This next work here by Roxy Paine Cleft from the series Dendroids. Another one you probably remember from last year. It's a massive stainless steel tree in front of the Northwestern Mutual building. I'm gonna sort of let Amy take it away from here because the installation story about this piece is pretty complicated and interesting.
Thank you for unmuting me. So yeah, with this installation process, as Brian was saying, when you work in the arts, it's not just painters or sculptors. There are so many different partners that we have with Sculpture Milwaukee. In these two images, you're seeing actually the massive hole that the crew from KEI had to dig out, and Kajawa Enterprises, they are the landscapers that actually maintain much of downtown, but also the NML campus. And then what you're seeing on the right is our contractors, Tri North, and they're experts in doing concrete work. And so we actually have this, in this massive hole on campus, and you're gonna have this concrete pad that I believe is 5 feet deep. And then what you see in the center is that those prongs and that circular thing, that's the thing that the actual trunk of the tree slides on top of and is anchored to. And this just ensures that, you know, there's never going to be an issue as far as safety with these installations. So we deal with engineers, you know, landscapers, concrete experts, art riggers. Here you're seeing a crane operator that actually has one of the branches rigged to that crane. And then on the right, you're seeing the actual trunk of the tree or the cleft. And so this are kind of two of like the installation shots, and it took 4 days to install. We had the artist studio come up and members of Methods and Materials, which is our art rigging crew. So it really was a large effort with many different partners and months of planning to do this. And then I love this shot. Thank you, Brian, for including this. This is called a maquette. And so actually when they were installing this piece, once the trunk was anchored to the concrete pad, then they have to attach all of those tiny little branches. It actually came on 3 different trucks from Arizona. And they welded everything on site. So that's why I say it was a 4-day process, because it wasn't just uncrating a sculpture and anchoring it to the ground. It is very complex. So you have one person on the ground, and then you have 2 people up in a cherry picker or articulated lift, and they are actually bending those tiny little branches that you see at the top of the maquette, so that it matches what the artist studio's intention for the installation would be.
So the next artist we have here is Julian Opie's Nari Walking. And you're just looking at a small animation video here that we've created to sort of preview the works in the exhibition this year. So I'll kind of just let that go. So what you're seeing here is a animated LED sculpture. So this is another work that sort of brings in some mobile units. Thinking about movement in sculpture is a pretty, not very new, but it is a contemporary mode of thinking. And Julian Opie is really sort of looking at hieroglyphics and emojis and thinking about the formalism and simplification of those. And that really restrains his process of creating these works. So there's probably hundreds of these works all around the world in different ways. I've seen them installed in photos on the sides of buildings in Hong Kong, and I've seen them in window fronts. The one we'll have is actually a 7-foot tall sort of screen monitor that'll stand on the sidewalk, also at Northwestern Mutual. So Jim Dine here is a pretty well-known artist. You're probably familiar with some of his work. It's a lot different than what you see here. He often has focused on tools and thinking about that. But this sort of sculpture here is a massive 8-foot tall head. And it's surrounded by branches. And this is the artist's head. So he's thinking about this history of self-portraiture and really documenting the body, but also including nature and what that might mean. Is it a cage of some kind? Is it an entrapment of some kind? And what does that mean to the artist? So here's another time-lapse video of the work being installed.
And if you see, this is actually, it's just east of the US Bank building, if people are familiar with Milwaukee. To the right, you're gonna see the massive crate on the trailer. And if the time-lapse works properly, you'll see the crane and the rigging system actually swinging it across over to that platform that you see to the left. And that's actually a steel plate. They are having it propped up because they have to actually attach the sculpture to the steel plate underneath, and then they drop down the sculpture. This is pretty impressive, but as far as having to use a crane, and there are many team members that are involved in actually installing the piece, it actually is fairly simple compared to some of our other installations that we're looking at this year.
Such as the Alex. So this work is installed in front of Northern Trust on the east side of the river. It's 526 Wisconsin. And this is titled Park Avenue Departure. And Alex Katz here is depicting his longtime muse and wife, Ada. And here you can see one side of the sculpture, but the other side of the sculpture looks the exact same. So it really really takes away any facial features away from the artist, which sort of allows the public to perhaps project more meaning into what could be happening here. I sort of really love this placement here and the photo with the bus stop image, because it makes you think, is this figure peeking over the street looking for a bus? What is going on here? And what you can't tell from this photo is the piece is only about, it's very thin. It's a very thin piece. So it sort of looks like a sign, which adds to the urban landscape where we see all types of signs all over the place. So thinking about what that adds to the language of these signs that are supposed to communicate really clear ideas downtown, such as no parking, this is a bus stop, but then what does this sort of sign look like, perhaps in an artistic approach? And here's a photo of them doing some work on site.
Yep, this is one of our members, our partners from Methods and Materials out of Chicago. This is John. He is welding actually on site. I think it was a heat index of 100 degrees. So we're used to installing usually in May, but things changed this year. So we're now learning that the complexities and stresses of working on site in the middle of summer, so in a Midwest summer. But yes, this is being welded onto the steel plate, and then as you saw in the previous slide, it was covered with landscaping, which hopefully will grow and flourish. And yeah, this is a great piece, and as Brian said, it's wonderful because it's very two-dimensional, but I think it's great to be viewed both from the sidewalk and from the street.
So the next book we have is Blob Monster by Tony Tassett. This artist you may remember from our previous exhibitions. There was a stacked, sort of like emoji heads titled Mood Sculpture that was up in 2018. And then as well as 2017, there was that sculpture with another set of arrows. And so Tony Tassett is a Midwestern artist. He's thinking about the iconography and pop art and thinking really about the high and low art and merging those in his artworks. So here he does that through using a symbol such as a monster, which maybe isn't as art historically present or serious, and you maybe find it more in horror films and modes of art like that. But then he's also mixing in the strip painting, which is a really well-known and identifiable art method that was really brought to light by Jackson Pollock. And so really combining those and thinking about what that means. What these pictures don't show you so much is how large this piece is. So it's 8 feet tall. This was an image I found online of the work being transported to the gallery. So this is an older image, but I thought that this sort of did a really great job of showing its scale and also sort of the humor that Tony Tassett plays with. I don't know if there was any other option, but I love that it's still sticking out of the back of this truck and anyone driving by is getting a glimpse of this as they're going by.
This is great, yeah. And from the previous slide, that's actually on the right, it shows the blob monster in Tony's studio, which is in Michigan. So I just think that that's a really great shot as well.
So this is one of the works that we do have installed right now. It's Anna Fasshauer's Tallulah Rapsody. This is, I think, one of my favorite works so far this year. At first I was, sort of thinking a lot about the very simple nature of it, but really the artist here is rejecting the ideas of minimalism by using her own body to sculpt this sculpture, and it's really hands-on. So unlike perhaps other minimal artists who design a sculpture and maybe send those designs to a fabricator to make them, Anna sources the aluminum and the aluminum sheets and sort of bends it with as much strength as she has using simple tools like a hammer to really get all these shapes. So everything you're seeing in this sculpture is made by her hand. So that just sort of, I guess, would lead into this, which you can see the riggers are handling this with their own hands rather than with a lift or a crane or something. So it is a different type of artwork and installing experience than something like the Dine, perhaps.
Yes, and this artwork only weighs 40 pounds, so this will be the lightest sculpture I believe we've ever had. But yes, the installation process being a hand carry, this actually came to us from LA, from a gallery out there, and was shuttled to Milwaukee. And I believe that entire installation process maybe took us an hour or so. So it was fairly quick.
And this is in front of the Associated Bank 250 East Wisconsin building. The next work, hopefully you've all have seen this one way or another. This is Carlos Rolon's Gild the Lily. And this piece was sort of a shocker last year when it wrapped the Chase building. So the piece originates from the artist's painting. So primarily, and his background really is in painting. And he paints these really beautiful flora from sort of like his own culture, and thinks about the ways of cultures traveling over borders and how borders are really sort of these made up things. And by placing this flora here in the middle of Wisconsin that really isn't native to here, what type of conversations is Carlos perhaps trying to have? So this is a Chicago artist that came up for a talk last year and kind of told us all about his background. If you have seen this sculpture, but you haven't taken the chance to go inside, I really do recommend that. I don't know if the Chase lobby is open for public right now, but at some point it will be, and you'll be able to go inside and see it sort of glow from the inside like stained glass.
And Brian, if I could interject about the Rolon, I mentioned commissioning works earlier. I had worked with Carlos Rolon in the past, and when he first came up to Chicago to do a site visit with me, we talked about him doing something on the skywalk across the river. However, that just became so cumbersome and difficult. I proposed to him that he use this cube, and Carlos is very interested in the modernist architecture, the international style that you see in Chicago. And his family's Puerto Rican, and it is really about the impact of colonization and imperialism on the aesthetics and peoples of these conquered places. Since Puerto Rico is in a very, very unique and odd position vis-a-vis the United States, I think that there's some really very latent political content in this work, but you don't have to know that. You can just say that this is something very exuberant and dynamic, and it transforms architecture. Part of the reason I wanted Carlos to do something quite this large is the year before, we'd had a lot of feedback from people complaining that the works aren't big enough. But as you can see from the different locations where we're installing artwork, any downtown street is just a sidewalk wide. There aren't that many plazas for us to do something really dynamic and large, and this just happens to be one of those locations. So, you know, we think as much, the curatorial team thinks a lot about, you know, what would enhance the location, the architecture, our experiences of the city. And I think Carlos is really the epitome of something that challenges the way we think of space.
Yeah, thanks, Marilu. I think that this piece does a fantastic job of transforming that intersection. It's really bright and cheerful now versus when it's just kind of, you can see through it through the glass. It's a really different experience now. And it was great to see over the winter as well with snow everywhere. It really stood out.
And I think one of the things that we should also mention, and I know Brian, you were primarily on site for this as well as Marilu, is that all of this is vinyl. And, you know, maybe Brian, you can just talk a little bit about the installation process and some of the challenges that they faced. Wind being one of them.
Sure. So I do recall that there was quite some heavy winds. And because of the wind, they can't be on lift to install the vinyl, and the vinyl blows, and it just creates a lot of headache in that way. But also there's a whole lot of sort of installation and logistics works that goes into the work before it even gets to Milwaukee. So that would include getting the drawings of the building and the actual size of each window pane for the artist so he can design this piece so it fits perfectly when it's coming to install. So this was a long time in the making, as Marilu said, and it also took a lot of pieces, and it was adapted directly from his Gild the Lily paintings.
The really central difference between the paintings and this is we did not want to sheathe the interior of the building so that it became this airless space. We wanted that interpenetration between inside and outside. So the parts where you don't see flowers is the actual gold leaf on the paintings. And we were really committed to the building owners. They didn't want us to just shut off the lobby from the outside, so that when you go by on the street, you can actually still look inside and see people going up and down the escalators. So there's a really, you know, it was a very nuanced set of negotiations that we went through with the building owners and the managers as well. So it looks really simple, but it was actually very complicated to pull this off. Also, you have people's skepticism towards altering the architecture in this dramatic a way. And it took a real team of people to help pull this off. So, you know, the founder, Steve Marcus, was involved, and the head of the bid was involved as well. So it was really worthwhile, though. I just think that some people think most public art is as simple as pick and plop, but it's not. This kind of commission takes a lot more nuanced negotiation to have a big impact like that.
Absolutely. And we're so happy to see it overwinter and be here for another season of Sculpture Milwaukee. So we're getting close to the end here. This is Nari Ward's Apollo/Pole 2017. These images here are really, they really do the piece justice. You can see that it serves sort of these two different messages. Apollo, one of them, and you might think automatically thinking about the space mission Apollo, but actually the artist Nari Ward is thinking about the theater in Harlem. So really thinking about the culture that has come out of Harlem and how that's spread really far past there. And then also Pole. So this piece will be placed outside of the Wisconsin Center District, which is where the DNC will be held. So in the audio tour that the artist has created, he thinks about the way that this piece does change meaning based off of where it's installed. And I think that that's a really great insight from an artist to really recognize that the audience and the location and the surroundings really do change the meaning of a work. So we're super excited to have this installed. It's very large, and that'll be coming in towards the end of the month.
And then this was actually, seems like a very simple thing, LED, just flickering on and off, but to get us to that point, this is actually where the piece is at Methods and Materials down in Chicago. We have two members of their team that really work on any of the electrical sculptures that we have. Nari Ward actually fabricated this sign out of simple materials, vinyl, plywood, things that weren't actually meant to withstand a permanent exhibition. This was originally commissioned by the Socrates Sculpture Park and then was most recently installed over at the Aldrich Contemporary in Connecticut. So after it had been exhibited at the Aldrich, it actually went back to the artist studio, and he almost refabricated the entire thing because this piece will be staying up over winter, and we know that the Wisconsin winters can be quite harsh. So in using more durable materials that will last over winter, and there will be less maintenance, because that's one of the things that we don't talk about much when we talk about public art, but is very important, is that we have to be good stewards of this artwork, and that means consistent maintenance throughout the exhibition. So we're dealing with all types of weather, all types of human interaction potentially, and natural. So yeah, this was a small victory for us, but we were very excited to see this. I'd never had to worry about sourcing 300 feet of LED that only one manufacturer makes and sends out. But that was one of the challenges I had to deal with and this year. And it's just one of the things that we have to worry about when putting together a large exhibition like this, where you're dealing with different elements. Yeah.
And another work that has overwintered and stayed here since last exhibition is Beverly Pepper's Provence Curva. And this last year was one of my favorites. And I think maybe we're noticing a theme here, but I'm just really interested in the way that Beverly Pepper has sort of resisted the male-dominated sort of geometric abstraction and sculpture past. And she's really using these organic forms that really flow into each other nicely. I like this image here on the right in the winter. It's a different view, but you can see that the piece, it doesn't look as maybe flat as that last image, where you can see it is actually, there is some depth to it and some layers going on here. And I know Marilu said pick and plop earlier. Amy, do you want to sort of explain what that means?
It's a simple term that I picked up from our art riggers, but essentially this artwork, when it came to us, It came on the truck straight to the site, and it's already attached to the steel plate. So they literally pick it up and plop it on the ground. And so it's quite simple as far as installation goes. But I also want to go back to the idea that when you're looking at this piece, and you can definitely see it in the last slide, that when talking about maintenance, Beverly Pepper, she, in using this Core 10 steel, actually prefers that we don't maintain it. She wants to have this kind of change to the surface as it sits outside. So I think it's quite beautiful in that regard too.
Mm-hmm. And then the furthest west piece, a part of the exhibition this year, is by Lawrence Weiner, and it's titled At the Same Moment. You can see it sort of mocked up in a picture at the top there. And this artist has been thinking about language for a long time. And I was listening to some video interviews with him, and he says over and over again that he wants to change culture. And his idea of doing that is by presenting very easily digestible art, and that is through text. So he's been very successful in doing that and making it sort of look as though it's been there the whole time. So I think that's perhaps the reason he chose the scale he did for this piece. And also the location of this is on the overpass between the Hilton City Center Hotel and the Wisconsin Center District. So thinking about who uses that overpass, what are they doing when they go through it? And what does the phrase "at the same moment" mean? Does it mean that there's cars driving beneath you while you're texting, walking through an overpass with a plane flying above you? Or does it mean something entirely different? I think that there's a lot of different ways to interpret what that phrase could mean, and that's sort of what the artist wants you to think about.
And in talking about the installation, I know Marilu had mentioned earlier with Carlos Rolón last year in trying to get approval to do something along the Skywalk. You know, now we're doing just that. So having to close down Wisconsin Avenue, which is the busiest street in Milwaukee, and have articulated lifts and experts that install vinyl is always going to come with challenges, but luckily we work with the city to get the proper permits and safety requirements for them to complete this work. And then it's also working with building owners and making sure that we can get approval for this artwork. And luckily we've been working with the city since 2017, and they haven't denied us on any of our requests yet. So they've been really big proponents of this project, beautifying the city, bringing art into the public sphere, which has been a great partnership.
Yeah, absolutely. So with that, we're going to enter our Q&A session here, but before we do that, I just want to point out this poster on the left side. It was designed by a MyEd student, and we sort of proposed to the MyEd students to design a poster that incorporates the artworks as well as the city of Milwaukee. So you can see the Gaslight building with the Paula Crown solo cup on top, and right behind that you see the Northwestern Mutual building. You might notice the Carlos Rolón type glass building with flowers on it. The Maggie Sasso sculpture is number 3, sort of at the bottom by 2020, and that's actually just the whole piece itself fitting in with the city, a part of the landscape. Number 4 is the drips on the Tony Tassett, and 5 is the Apollo sort of being airlifted in. So we just sort of wanted to show that to you here, and you'll probably see a little bit more of it as we install the rest of our works in the coming month. But with that, I think we can open it up to questions.
Yeah, we've had a number of really great questions come in, so keep them coming. I know we're short for time for Q&A, but we will work with Brian, Amy, and Marilu to try to answer them with the follow-up materials that we send out as well. Both Lawrence and Jill asked questions that are related to returning sculptures from previous years. Lawrence asked if you can clarify why certain works from previous editions are being reinstalled. And then Jill's question in my mind is kind of connected, so I'll let Brian or Amy or Marilu jump in. Jill asked, are there any returning sculptures that were purchases, such as Holiday Home, Cleft, and Gild the Lily?
Actually, if I can talk about why works over winter, because that's sort of a curatorial discussion. Part of the reasons we let things overwinter is because we still want to animate the street and keep works up to keep conversation about Sculpture Milwaukee going on. We brought the Druka back because with our partnership with Black Box Fund, we wanted to expand the conversation that we're having with them. And it's a piece by a Milwaukee-based artist. We have a production investment in it. By putting it back up, we hope that we can engage people in conversations about the lake, since it is a site-specific commission. Also, if somebody would buy the work, it actually is really great for Sculpture Milwaukee, because we've been so lucky with people buying things and then putting them in public view. So the thing about Paul Druka's work, somebody could sure buy it, but probably it has to be by somebody who's near a Great Lake. And that sort of, reduces the number of people who can actually buy the work. Once the work is purchased, at the end of the exhibition cycle, the work is then turned over to the new owners. We call the works that are around town, like the Bailey and the Crag, part of our legacy, but it's not our collection. We don't own them.
Right. And as a part of last year's exhibition, perhaps this is maybe an answer to the second part of that question, which is one of the works last year was purchased and donated to a local institution, the America's Black Holocaust Museum, and that is the Sanford Biggers. So there was an unveiling of that earlier this year. Right now that museum is not open to the public because of our current situation in the world, but once they open back up, that sculpture will be on view and a part of their exhibit.
Great. Ellie asked a very interesting question with the kind of current trend for taking down historic statues in public spaces. So I think this one will have lots of great discussion. And she asked specifically, thinking through the kind of trauma that those sculptures have inherent in them and places where they might end up, that they can be preserved and that people can learn from, and kind of the feelings and trends in the art and curatorial community about public sculpture and that exact piece of where should they live on and how can they be preserved and have communities learn from them.
I can maybe jump in on this answer. This is not the first time when the art world has seen a rush of dismantling public art. When the Soviet Union fell, there was a lot of Stalin sculptures taken down. When Iraq was overthrown, there were a lot of Saddam Hussein sculptures that were taken down. And it's not the first time where we've seen sculptures of Confederate generals or slavers taken down either. And I think it's really important to understand that the Confederate general sculptures, for example, were not installed after the Civil War, but well into the Jim Crow era of the early 20th century. And these were symbols of a reinscribed racism in America. And so that, we're really very sensitive to the fact that these have very specific meanings to some people. I think the fact that our current president wants to put sculptures to great people in one place, I think is interesting. Certainly these works should be a reminder of our history and perhaps put in history museums, and that way contextualized. I want to say that when I ran a sculpture park in St. Louis, somebody wanted to take a Confederate general sculpture down and give it to us, but we were doing contemporary art and we didn't really have the capacity to frame this conversation. So I think this is a really very important conversation. There's another thread to this though, and that is, are these sculptures great art? Are they pretty rote genre sculptures? Man on horse is the typical one, 3/4 bust, full portraits. I would argue that the sculpture in Sculpture Milwaukee is a much more diverse range of artistic practice. Almost without exception, the works that are being taken down are really sort of self-aggrandizement. It's really about country building or, imposing some sort of political beliefs on the people around them. But it's a good question. I don't know who would volunteer to take one of those pieces. I don't know if the Haggerty has any of that kind of controversial work on their campus or not. You have a very active public art program yourselves. Would the Haggerty take one of those pieces if one was donated to you?
I'll defer to Lynn, who's a curator and not myself. Good luck, Lynn.
Yeah, getting sculpture on campus is also a pretty lengthy process. And I would say that most of the work we have up right now is not very controversial. Some of it is religious, some of it is abstract, but I'm not really in a position to talk about what we would be able to accept.
But we do have more questions, so that's exciting. We have one from Bianca that's interesting about the relationship between Milwaukee Sculpture and some of Milwaukee's galleries and dealers and the loan of artworks and what that working relationship looks like and how it might impact the selection of artwork.
Marilu, did you want to talk about this?
Sure, I'll answer that question. So, the mandate for Sculpture Milwaukee is that we bring in artists from all over. That we do commissions from local artists. We borrow works from New York and LA primarily because that's where the dealers are. We borrow work from Europe as well, mainly London. One of the biggest impediments for finding artwork that can go outside is finding an artist who has been supported enough to produce a work that could go outside. So for example, a bronze sculpture is extremely expensive to produce. You know, you have to make the maquette, the little model, you have to then cast it, blow it up, cast it, etc. And that can be $100,000 to start with or significantly more. Milwaukee has some artists who have made some works that are capable of going outside. We have worked with the Green Gallery. Maggie Cecil is not showing with a gallery locally. Jason Yee has shown with people in town as well. So, we are very mindful of working with the artists in our community because again, our curatorial goal is to actually put some of the artists in our region into this international context. But bringing artwork to the street is not the only thing we do. For example, the audio scripts, I'm working with professors at Marquette, at UWM. I'm working with artists who have very different backgrounds. Maybe they're performance artists or concrete poet artists, et cetera, et cetera. So we really recognize that there's all different kinds of art forms that can help impact Sculpture Milwaukee. And we're really trying to stretch the definition of sculpture as well. So I hope I answered that question. Any other thoughts?
I was just going to chime in there for a second because I've heard Marilu say this in many meetings when she talks about the curatorial process, is that you can't maybe just go to a warehouse and there's thousands of sculptures and you say, I want that one, I want that one. There's a lot of process that goes into it. It starts with the curatorial process, and Marilu and Russell Bowman, who was on our team, they really have these strong relationships with gallerists that are in New York and LA, Chicago, and they've built this over their career. And then after that, it really just looks at, once we have an artwork and it's chosen and it's agreed upon with the lender, what can we do with engineering? We can only put the Beverly Pepper in a certain location. It can't be on hollow sidewalks. So it's size that matters as far as like where we're going to put a piece. As Marilu had already said, it's materials too. So we have to make sure that these materials can stay outside over a long period of time or just outside period. So yeah.
And I will add, Amy, thank you for saying that, Amy. We did have a piece 2 years ago by a Serbian artist named Ana Pravaci, who does a series of shadows that she spray paints on sidewalks. And I wanted to bring her work in partially because I think her dialogue is really very funny, but also it asks some very deep questions about, well, how are artists made? How do they start their careers? What do they think about? And what are the shadows the past throws on them? And so there was a lot of head scratching when our team spray painted the shadow of Michelangelo at 6 in Wisconsin. Luckily, that kind of work is really pretty easy to maintain. You just have to touch it up with more spray paint. That's a really tricky corner, 6 in Wisconsin, because it's really high traffic and we've had some disrespect shown the artwork that we've put there in the past. But it's really about, the show ultimately should be about finding as diverse a range of voices as possible. And if our mandate is to look at the globe, we have to really be mindful of pulling people from other parts of the world.
I think we're short on time, but there are a few questions that have still come in. And so I can compile that list, and maybe especially Tony's question about percentage of female artists represented in Sculpture Milwaukee this year and past years would be interesting, but I think we can probably try to answer those in follow-up materials.
So
yeah, I think that sounds great. And I was just gonna say we can also include some links to these preview animations for the sculptures as well. And I should just mention that the remainder of the installation will be on the week of July 27th. So that whole week there might be some cranes on the street. As Amy said, we might have to shut down Wisconsin Avenue for just half a day to install some vinyl and stuff like that. But then by the beginning of August, the whole exhibition should be up.
And I just want to say thank you to our audience for joining us today, and a big thank you to Marilu, Amy, and Brian. And also a huge thank you to my colleagues, Christine, Rachel, and Mary. We made it through without any major technical glitches, so that's a good thing.
We did
anyway,
it.
Get out and see Sculpture Milwaukee. And once again, thanks to everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Lynn, for inviting us to have this conversation.
My pleasure.
Wonderful.
Bye.